The United Nations has just slashed food aid by 40%. Millions across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East are left staring at empty bowls. And yet, in Western capitals, shelves overflow. Bread is tossed out nightly in New York, Paris, and London. Then comes the shock. While the world mourns the cut, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso says maybe this is exactly what Africa needs. Because if hunger is the chain, maybe breaking that chain means refusing to kneel. Before we dive deeper, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And how do food choices or habits affect your own daily life? Your perspective matters? This community thrives when voices from America, Africa, and beyond come together. You're watching Africa Daily Good News. We bring you the stories others ignore, with Africa at the center of the world stage. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button, stay with us, and let's grow this conversation together. And now, let's move from the headlines to the ground reality, to understand why this cut may not only be a crisis, but also a turning point. 40% gone overnight. That's how much the United Nations just cut from its global food aid budget, a move that has left entire regions staring into uncertainty. When you hear that number, it sounds like a statistic. But behind it are refugee camps where rations are being halved, clinics where mothers no longer receive fortified flour, and villages where the food truck simply doesn't come anymore. At first glance, it feels like a bureaucratic adjustment, something far away from daily life. Yet according to WFP officials, this is the steepest cut in decades. Millions in Sudan, Somalia, Gaza, even Afghanistan now face the kind of hunger that doesn't just gnaw at the stomach. It rewrites the future of a generation. The paradox? At the very same moment, food waste in wealthy nations remains staggering. In America, studies show households toss away nearly 30% of purchased groceries. Think about that. While one family debates which brand of cereal to buy, another family halfway across the world is debating which child gets to eat tonight. And here comes a subtle twist. People assume food aid is endless, like a tap you can always turn back on. But when funding collapses, the tap doesn't drip. It shuts. Camps that once had long lines now have empty courtyards. A short story from South Sudan illustrates it sharply. A local teacher recalled how last year her students could at least count on a school meal. Now, classrooms are half empty, not because kids dropped out, but because hunger kept them home. That change, from learning to simply surviving, shows how fragile the system really is. Some might argue if Americans waste so much food, why not just ship the excess overseas? But the reality isn't that simple. Supply chains, costs, and politics block the way. And deeper still, the question rises. If Africa continues to depend on these shipments, what happens every time the donor's mood swings? After all, most people in the US don't think about how global aid budgets get cut. They only notice rising grocery prices at home. Yet when belts tighten in Washington or Brussels, the consequences fall hardest on the villages thousands of miles away. So the issue is larger than a missing truckload of rice. It's about whether whole continents remain at the mercy of decisions made in foreign capitals. And this tension between dependency and dignity is where Africa's own leaders are starting to speak out. One of them, in Burkina Faso, is already turning hunger into a political battleground. Governments that once wrote blank checks for wars suddenly claim they can't spare dollars for bread. That contradiction cuts deeper than numbers on a budget sheet. It exposes a hierarchy of priorities. In Washington, defense bills pass with bipartisan speed. In Brussels, energy subsidies sail through without hesitation. But when the conversation shifts to feeding families in Niger or Mali, the answer is hesitation, delay, or a flat no. This isn't just a policy quirk. It's a mirror held up to the world. According to global surveys, the average American spends more on dining out in a month than the UN can now provide to a refugee family in an entire season. That contrast feels almost surreal, and it raises a subtle question for anyone watching. If ordinary people understood that their Friday night dinner equals another family's survival, would they see aid differently? Here comes a quieter twist. Western leaders insist the cuts are about budget stress. Yet at the same time, luxury spending in their capitals hits record highs. The champagne flows in Paris. fashion shows return to London. Stadiums in Los Angeles overflow with fans paying hundreds of dollars a ticket. Meanwhile, a camp in Chad cancels its food distribution because the trucks never left the warehouse. The logic is inverted, but the system continues. And then there's the human factor. Before the cut, aid workers in Ethiopia described children at least receiving one reliable meal each day. After the cut, they described the same children returning, weaker, hungrier, sometimes not at all. That before and after shift isn't abstract. It's a transformation of behavior, of hope. A teacher might go from encouraging students to focus on their future to simply telling them to conserve energy and survive the present. For many Americans, the instinct is to ask, why can't others just become self-reliant? But that question has a twist too. Dependency didn't appear by accident. It was built over decades of policies that discouraged local farming and encouraged imports. If people could always flip a switch and be self-sufficient, they would. The reality is more tangled, and that's exactly why leaders like Ibrahim Traoré now see this crisis as a wake-up call rather than a death sentence. The stage is being set for a clash, not just over food, but over dignity. As the donors tighten their fists, Africa's response is no longer quiet. From the fields of Burkina Faso to the markets of Bamako, a different voice is rising, one that says, perhaps hunger can be resisted not with more charity, but with sovereignty. And this is where the story takes a sharper turn. While the UN cuts food, Burkina Faso is building factories. That's the paradox nobody expected. In the middle of warnings about famine, Captain Ibrahim Traoré is investing in rice mills, irrigation canals, and local grain storage. The message is sharp. Instead of pleading for bread, he wants his people to bake their own. For decades, Africa has been framed as dependent, waiting for foreign donors to deliver salvation. But here comes a twist. What if the real danger isn't hunger itself, but the habit of waiting? In the United States, studies show most families keep at least a week's worth of food in pantries. The psychology is simple. Security comes from knowing tomorrow's meal is already there. Now imagine an African village where security depends not on a pantry, but on a distant agency's budget meeting. That contrast explains why Traoré's defiance resonates. There's a human story that illustrates this. In a small Burkinabe town, farmers recently gathered for the opening of a new rice processing plant. One elder compared it to the day electricity first arrived in his village. Before, nights were dark. After, everything changed. The same way, he said, this factory could flip hunger into strength. That before and after shift captures the essence. Dignity doesn't come from imported sacks, it comes from local hands turning soil into grain. And yet, critics in Western media call this dangerous nationalism. Here's the quiet twist inside the twist. The same countries that lecture Africa on global markets are the ones heavily subsidizing their own farmers. According to OECD reports, American and European agriculture receives billions each year in government protection. If protection is normal in Iowa or Normandy, why should it be dangerous in Ouagadougou? The logic is hard to ignore. If people can produce for themselves, they change not just their diets but their politics. Dependency breeds silence, sovereignty breeds voice. And maybe that's the deeper reason why Traoré's push unsettles the old order. Because once people taste self-reliance, it's difficult to convince them to go back. So the question lingers. Is this about food, or is it about power disguised as food? That question is not only for Africans, it's for anyone who has ever wondered who controls the plate in front of them. If you're watching, think about your own habits. Do you feel secure because you can always buy what you need? Or because you know you could make it if supply chains stopped? This shift in Burkina Faso doesn't close the story. It opens a door. Because the deeper issue is not how much Africa imports today, but why it spends billions importing food it could grow tomorrow. And that brings us to the next layer of the problem. Africa spends more than $43 billion every single year importing food it could grow at home. That number feels unreal when you remember the continent holds some of the richest farmland on Earth. The contradiction is sharp. Fertile soil sits untouched, while ships loaded with rice and wheat dock at African ports, invoices paid in foreign currency. At first, It looks like just another trade imbalance, but the deeper twist is this. Dependency is not only financial, it's psychological. Once a society builds habits around imports, the idea of local production feels riskier than the actual hunger. According to behavioral research, most people prefer a predictable routine, even if it's flawed, over the uncertainty of change. That explains why imported bread on a shelf can appear safer than planting a field, even when the field is waiting to be planted. And yet, the picture is more complicated. In Nigeria, families who once relied on imported rice turned to local harvests during global price spikes. At first, many resisted, claiming the taste and quality weren't the same. Months later, the same households admitted they had adapted, because hunger changes perception faster than policy. That before and after story shows how human behavior bends when survival presses hard enough. But here lies another quiet paradox. In the United States, most people don't even notice where their food comes from. Surveys show the average shopper cares more about price tags than origin labels. In Africa, by contrast, origin isn't a choice, it's a matter of life or death. The irony is heavy. The places that could grow the most often consume the least of their own. And there's a hidden layer. Every dollar spent importing food is a dollar not spent on schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. Leaders like Traoré know this equation well. By cutting imports and boosting domestic output, the ripple isn't just food security, it's political security. Because once you control your plate, you start controlling your destiny. So the real issue is not simply why Africa imports food today, but why the system was designed that way in the first place. And that path takes us straight into history's shadow, where the roots of dependency were planted long before today's hunger crisis. Colonial powers once designed Africa to export raw goods while importing basic food. The contradiction is staggering. Lands that produced cocoa, cotton, and gold for Europe were left unable to feed their own people. That wasn't an accident, it was a structure. The system rewarded exports and punished self-reliance, locking entire nations into dependency that outlived the flag-raising ceremonies of independence. History books often treat this as a chapter closed, but the echo is alive. Farmers in Burkina Faso, for example, were encouraged to grow cotton for foreign markets while rice imports filled local kitchens. The result? Families became specialists in feeding other nations, but strangers at their own tables. That inversion of priorities still shapes today's hunger map. And here comes a subtle twist. Western commentators now argue Africa must integrate more into global supply chains. Yet those supply chains were the very chains that created dependency in the first place. It's like telling someone who lost their freedom to trust the same lock that once held them captive. According to studies of post-colonial economies, nations that leaned hardest into export monocultures are the ones most vulnerable to food insecurity today. There's a human story that captures this. An old Burkinabe farmer recalled how his grandfather once grew a wide variety of crops, sorghum, millet, beans, but after colonial authorities demanded cotton, diversity disappeared. Before, our fields were full, he said, after they were narrowed. That before and after memory is more than nostalgia. It's evidence of how deliberate policies shaped daily survival. Think about how habits form. In America, once supermarkets spread across suburbs, people stopped planting backyard gardens. A generation later, most no longer even consider it. In Africa, the same shift happened under colonial pressure, but with far heavier consequences. When imports became the norm, local farming lost its prestige, and over time, even its knowledge. If people could simply flip back, they would. But habits passed down for decades don't dissolve overnight. This is why the hunger crisis today feels less like a natural disaster and more like history's unfinished business. The old design still lingers in trade agreements, in subsidies, in the mindset that Africa should buy what it can grow. And as the present collides with the past, another stage begins to open, one where hunger is no longer just a colonial shadow, but a battlefield for sovereignty in the modern age. The world now counts hunger in statistics, but in Africa it is measured in voices. UN reports warn that the continent sits at the very center of a global food crisis, yet on the ground the story is not only about scarcity, It is about defiance. The unusual reality is that in the middle of emergency alerts, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré speak of sovereignty, not sympathy. That shift alone unsettles the old narrative. For decades, aid agencies set the stage, while African nations were treated as the audience. Now, the roles are reversing. Mini hook. The very moment when rations are shrinking is also the moment when African farmers are demanding bigger harvests of their own. It sounds contradictory, but maybe that is the twist. Scarcity has become fuel for ambition. Consider the human side. In Burkina Faso, a group of young farmers recently abandoned the idea of waiting for international NGOs to distribute seed. Instead, they pooled their money, bought land collectively, and planted rice. The first yield was modest, but the pride was larger than the harvest. Before, they saw themselves as recipients. After, they saw themselves as producers. That before and after change in self-perception is as powerful as any policy announcement. The psychology matters. Most Americans, when shelves run low during a storm, rush to stock up on water and canned food. It's a survival reflex born of abundance. In contrast, many African families don't have that cushion. They adapt in ways outsiders rarely understand, stretching meals, sharing across households, inventing substitutes. If human beings can adapt this quickly under strain, then the real question is not whether Africa can endure, but how much stronger it becomes after enduring. And here comes a quiet twist layered within. Hunger, once a symbol of weakness, is turning into a rallying point. Reports of empty plates no longer only generate pity, they spark debate about dignity, control, and the right to decide who feeds whom. The battlefield is shifting from the distribution lines of the UN to the fields and factories of Africa itself. This rising momentum doesn't close the chapter. It pushes the story forward. Because if hunger was once the silent chain, today it is the sound of that chain cracking. And what follows is not only about food, it is about sovereignty, identity, and the power to write a future that no longer begins with dependency. The world just cut food aid, yet Africa is talking about sovereignty. That contradiction is more than headlines. It is a turning point. Hunger was supposed to silence, but in places like Burkina Faso, it is becoming a language of resistance. The paradox is hard to miss. The fewer the rations, the louder the call for independence. Across refugee camps and farmland, the same scene repeats itself in opposite forms. One family waits for a shipment that may never arrive. Another family, just a few miles away, plants seeds in soil that had been ignored for years. The contrast feels like two versions of the same future. One chained to dependency, the other betting on self-reliance. Which one prevails will shape not just Africa, but the world's balance of power. There's a story from a Burkina Faso village where elders gathered after hearing the UN's budget cuts announced on the radio. Some shook their heads in despair. But one farmer stood up and said, "If we can no longer rely on their trucks, then let's rely on our fields." That simple shift, from despair to decision, captures the mood spreading across the continent. Before, hunger was humiliation. After, it is becoming motivation. For many Americans, the closest comparison might be the early days of the pandemic, when shelves went empty and suddenly people remembered the value of local supply. According to surveys, millions started backyard gardens not for pleasure but for security. Human behavior reveals a pattern. When systems fail, people return to what they can control. Africa today is at that same junction, but on a far greater scale. And here's the deeper twist. By cutting aid, the West thought it was tightening control. Instead, it may have unlocked a wave of defiance. If people discover they can stand without the crutch, they may never ask for it again. That's the fear in foreign capitals and the hope in African ones. So the story doesn't end with empty plates. It ends with a fork in the road. Dependency or dignity, begging or building, silence or sovereignty. And the choice is no longer abstract. It's unfolding right now. If you believe these stories matter, hit subscribe, like, and share so more voices can join this conversation. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what do you think? Can Africa truly feed itself without Western aid? This was Africa Daily Good News. Stay with us because the next story we're covering will show just how quickly the old order can unravel and how fast a new one might rise.